The grand chamber of the Othrisian Synod did not merely hold silence, it entombed it. In the vast, cavernous hollow carved from the living obsidian of the Capitol's spire, the air hung heavy and stagnant, smelling faintly of ozone and the decaying sweetness of the hydroponic gardens that were slowly failing 300 levels below. Here, beneath the vaulted ceiling that arched so high it was lost in shadow, the rulers of the Voltari people sat upon hovering daises of spun glass and light, their slender, translucent limbs tucked beneath robes of iridescent weave. They were a people of grace, of fragility, and of an ancient, terrifying stillness. For 10,000 rotations of their dying star, the Voltari had cultivated a civilization of pure aesthetic and absolute order, a society where a raised voice was a crime and a sudden movement was a symptom of madness. But today, the stillness was a lie. Today, the silence was not peace. It was the holding of breath before the executioner's stroke. The central holographic projector, a massive sphere of coherent light dominating the center of the chamber, displayed the one thing that had shattered their collective composure: the approach vector. High Archon Malachar, the eldest of the Synod, felt the tremors of his own hearts, all three of them beating in a dissonant rhythm that bordered on pain, as he stared at the red trajectory lines scarring the display. He adjusted the filtration mask that covered his lower face, a device necessary now that the planetary atmospheric scrubbers were operating at critical inefficiency. His compound eyes, usually dull with the wisdom of centuries, faceted the red light into 1,000 shards of panic. He looked across the chamber to the other 12 members of the High Council, seeing his own dread mirrored in their stiff postures and the nervous flickering of their bioluminescent nodes. They were the oldest civilization in this arm of the galaxy, the architects of the crystalline spires, the weavers of light music, the philosophers of the quiet void. And they were dying. The blight had taken the crops, the core instability had poisoned the tectonic plates, and their sun, the once glorious Solara, was dimming due to a stellar parasitic dampening field they lacked the technology to remove. In their desperation, in a moment of weakness that Malachar now regretted with every fiber of his being, they had sent a transmission, a generic wideband distress call, a scream into the dark. "It was a mistake," Malachar whispered, his voice amplified by the acoustic perfection of the chamber so that it sounded like the rustle of dry leaves in a winter wind. "We cast a net into the abyss hoping for a savior, and we have caught a predator." He gestured with a slender, trembling hand toward the display. "Look at the energy signatures. Look at the hull density. These are not rescue vessels. These are world breakers." Across the chamber, Archivist Villo shifted on her dais. She was younger than Malachar, her carapace still retaining the sheen of youth, her mind less encrusted with the dogmatic fear of the outside. She looked at the data streaming alongside the trajectory lines, complex mathematics that described fusion drives of impossible inefficiency and power, hull plating thick enough to withstand the crush of a gas giant, and kinetic shielding that crackled with raw, unrefined aggression. "They answered," Villo said softly, her voice melodic but firm. "Of all the stars we reached out to, of all the silent neighbors who ignored our plea as our atmosphere turned to ash, they were the only ones who turned their ships around. The erratic transmission we received. The translation is clumsy, yes, but the intent was clear. They are coming to assist." "Assist?" Malachar let out a sound that was half hiss, half sigh. "You speak of the Terrans, Archivist, you speak of the Deathworlders." The word hung in the air like a curse. In the galactic community, what remained of it, isolated and paranoid, the designation Deathworld was not merely a classification of gravity or bacterial lethality, it was a moral judgment. Worlds where the environment itself tried to kill its inhabitants every second of every day produced a specific kind of life: hyper-aggressive, paranoid, violent, and endlessly hungry. "I have accessed the old archives, Villo. I have seen the fragmentary records of their history. They do not build, they conquer. They do not harmonize, they subjugate. Their planet, this Earth, is a hellscape of tectonic violence, extreme thermal variance, and biological competition so fierce that their very blood is filled with hunter-killer cells. And you believe such creatures come to save the delicate gardens of Volta. They come to scavenge. They come because they smell a corpse." The hologram shifted, zooming in on the lead vessel of the approaching fleet. It was ugly. There was no other word for it in the Voltari lexicon. It lacked the smooth curves and organic flows of civilized engineering. It was a block of scarred gray metal, bristling with antennas, sensor arrays, and protruding maneuvering thrusters. It looked like a brick thrown through a glass window. It possessed no grace, only mass. It did not glide through the ether. It shoved the vacuum aside through brute force propulsion. "We have no defenses left," Councilman Thraxis murmured from the shadows, his voice quavering. "The solar shields failed 3 cycles ago. The orbital arrays are silent. If they wish to take the water that remains or strip the crust for minerals, we can do nothing but watch. Perhaps we should silence the beacon. Perhaps if we go dark, they will pass us by." "They are already decelerating," Villo countered, her fingers dancing over the hard light interface before her. "They have crossed the outer marker. They are entering the gravity well. If they intended to strike, they would have launched kinetic bombardment from long range. They would have softened us. That is the Predator's way, but they are hailing us, continuously." She looked up, her large, dark eyes fixing on Malachar. "We are dying, High Archon. We are drowning in our own toxic air. We have the dignity of a tomb. If the Deathworlders kill us, we are no worse off than we are now. But if there is even a fraction of a chance that their chaotic biology allows them to understand survival in a way we have forgotten, we must answer." Malachar closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the mountain above him. He remembered the days of the Golden Age when the Voltari fleets sailed on solar winds, trading art and philosophy with the stars. Now they were reduced to huddled, frightened things in the dark, waiting for the monsters to kick down the door. He thought of the nursery creches, where the larvae were failing to pupate because the air was too thin. He thought of the silent music halls. He realized with a cold, crystalline clarity that Villo was right. Pride was a luxury of the living. "Open the channel," Malachar commanded, his voice hollow. "Let us hear the voice of the end." The holographic sphere dissolved into static, a storm of white noise that made the council members flinch. Then the image resolved. It was not a sterile, computer-generated avatar like the Voltari used. It was a live feed. The creature on the screen was hideous in its density. It sat in a chair that looked like a pilot's crash couch, surrounded by physical switches and glowing analog displays. The creature had no carapace. Its skin was soft, pale, and seemingly unprotected, yet stretched over layers of muscle that hinted at a gravity tolerance 3 times that of Volter. It had hair, fur, growing in a patch on top of its head and on the lower part of its face. Its eyes were small, binocular, forward-facing, predator eyes. They scanned the camera with an intensity that felt physical. "This is Admiral Elias Thorne of the United Terran Coalition Heavy Engineering Division," the creature spoke. The universal translator struggled with the guttural, resonance-heavy tones of the human language, flattening the emotional variance but conveying the raw sound. "We received a distress signal designated Priority Alpha from this sector. We are reading massive atmospheric destabilization and a magnetosphere collapse. We are holding position at high orbit. Requesting permission to send down an assessment team. Do you copy?" The voice was not screaming. It was not threatening. It was terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of a being standing in the center of a hurricane and discussing the weather. Malachar leaned forward, his hands gripping the edges of his dais. "This is High Archon Malachar of the Voltari. We receive you, Admiral Thorne. You are far from your territory. Why have you answered?" The human on the screen blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. "Because you asked, Archon, and because our sensors indicate you have about 3 standard weeks before your biosphere undergoes total necrotic failure. We can fix it, but we need to land. Now." "Fix it?" Malachar's mandibles clicked in disbelief. "Our core is cooling, our star is dying. These are celestial mechanics, inevitabilities of entropy. One does not fix the death of a world." "With all due respect, Archon," the human said, and for a moment the lips pulled back to reveal white, calcium-rich teeth in a gesture the translator identified as a grimace, but Malachar interpreted as a threat display. "You're thinking like people who live in a garden. We come from a rock that tries to freeze us, burn us, and shake us off every other Tuesday. Entropy is just an engineering challenge. Permission to land." The silence stretched again, thinner this time, brittle. Malachar looked at Villo. She gave a slow, singular nod. "Permission granted," Malachar whispered. "May the great silence have mercy on us." The descent of the human shuttle was an affront to the sky. The Voltari ships, when they still flew, descend. D-like feathers, riding anti-gravitic waves in silence. The Terran dropship tore through the cloud layers with a roar that shook the spires of the capital city. It was a brutal, fiery entry, trailing plasma and sonic booms that shattered the delicate crystal windows of the lower districts. To the citizens cowering in their hab blocks, it sounded like the wrath of gods. When the ship landed on the high plaza, the landing struts crunched into the ancient mosaic tiles, cracking artwork that had stood for 4,000 years. Steam hissed from the cooling vents, fogging the already dim air. A detachment of the High Guard, ceremonial warriors armed with energy staves that hadn't been fired in centuries, stood in a trembling semicircle, their armor polished but their spirits broken. Malachar and Villo stood at the forefront, unprotected, waiting. The ramp of the human ship descended with a mechanical whine. Atmosphere rushed out, not the sterile air of a ship, but air that smelled of recycled carbon, coffee, and machine oil. Heavy footsteps clanged against the metal ramp. The humans emerged. There were 6 of them. They wore bulky environmental suits, but the helmets were retracted, leaving their heads exposed to the toxic Voltari air. Malachar recoiled. The air here was laden with sulfur and heavy metals from the failing scrubbers. It should be burning their soft lung tissue. Yet they breathed it. They breathed it and merely looked uncomfortable, as if they had walked into a room with a bad smell rather than a lethal atmosphere. Admiral Thorne led them. He was shorter than the average Voltari, but he was twice as wide. His density was palpable. He moved with a heaviness that suggested he was accustomed to a gravity that would crush a Voltari's skeleton into dust. He stopped 5 paces from Malachar. He didn't bow. He didn't perform the rite of greeting. He simply stood there, hands resting on his belt, looking around at the dying city, the crumbling spires, the gray, choked sky. "It's worse than the scans showed," Thorne said, turning to one of his companions, a female human holding a scanning device. "Particulate count is off the charts. How are they even breathing?" "They aren't, sir," the female replied, her voice clipped and professional. "Respiratory failure is imminent for 90% of the population. They're running on reserves." Thorne turned back to Malachar, the Predator eyes locked onto the High Archon. "We don't have time for diplomacy, Archon. I'm going to be blunt. Your planet isn't just dying, it's been murdered. But we can restart the heart if you let us work. We brought the Hephaestus." "Murdered?" Villo stepped forward, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "What do you mean? The decline has been gradual for centuries." Thorne looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Not natural. We found signatures in your upper atmosphere, damping fields. Someone put a chokehold on your sun and destabilized your core to finish the job. But that's a fight for later. Right now, we need to drill." "Drill?" Malachar asked, horrified. "You intend to pierce the crust? The seismic feedback alone would shatter our cities." "Not if we harmonize the charges," the human engineer interjected. "We use resonance waves. We liquefy the obstruction in the mantle, inject a hyperdense alloy compound to stabilize the plates, and then jumpstart the magnetic dynamo. It's loud, it's violent, but it works. We did it to Mars 300 years ago. Now it has forests." "Mars," Malachar repeated the word, tasting the alien syllables. "You terraform dead worlds." "We terraform our worlds," Thorne corrected. "And sometimes, when we find good people stuck in a bad spot, we help out. But you need to understand something. Once we start, we can't stop. The Hephaestus is a planetary siege engine. We're going to bombard your crust with localized kinetic drivers. It's going to look like we're destroying the planet. Your people will panic. You need to keep them calm. If you fire on us, we stop and you die. Do you understand?" The sheer arrogance of it staggered Malachar. These short, dense, ugly creatures walked onto his world, breathed his poison air, and proposed to assault his planet to save it. It went against every tenet of Voltari philosophy. One did not fight nature, one accepted the flow, but the flow was death. "Why?" Malachar asked, his voice trembling. "Why do this? We have nothing to offer you. We have no resources you cannot find in asteroids. We have no strategic value. We are a tomb. Why spend your energy, your resources, your time?" Thorne looked down, kicking a loose piece of mosaic tile with his heavy boot. He looked tired. For the first time, Malachar saw not a predator, but something else, a deep, weary sadness etched into the lines of the human's face. "Because we know what it's like," Thorne said quietly. "To look up at the sky and know the universe wants you dead. We almost lost Earth, twice. Once to ourselves, once to something else. We screamed into the void and no one answered. We promised that if we survived, if we ever got out of the mud and the blood, we wouldn't be the ones who stayed silent. We are the Deathworlders, Archon. We don't fear the dark. We are the things that hunt the dark." He looked up and the intensity returned, hard as iron. "Now, do we have an accord, or should I pack up and let you fade away with dignity?" Malachar looked at the gray sky. He looked at Villo, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and hope. He looked at the human, this creature of violence and survival. "Do it," Malachar said. The weeks that followed were a waking nightmare for the Voltari. The human fleet did not orbit with grace. It swarmed. Massive industrial platforms descended into the lower atmosphere, casting shadows that plunged entire continents into twilight. The sound was constant, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated the very bones of the Voltari people. The Hephaestus, the flagship of the engineering corps, positioned itself directly over the planetary pole. It was a ship built around a massive central cannon, but a cannon designed to shoot magma, not warheads. From the safety of the Synod chamber, Malachar watched the tactical feeds. The humans were as good as their word, and it was terrifying. They dropped kinetic penetrators into the fault lines. The ground shook. Ancient spires that had stood for millennia swayed. Dust plumes rose into the stratosphere, turning the gray sky to a choked black. Panic spread through the populace. The High Guard requested permission to engage the invaders daily. Malachar denied them, holding the line with a fragility that felt like it would snap at any moment. "They are destroying us," Counselor Thraxis wailed on the 7th day, as a particularly violent tremor knocked a crystalline bust from its pedestal, shattering it. "The crust cannot take this. They are mad. They are brutes smashing a clock to fix the gears." Willow was glued to the comms station, monitoring the human chatter. "They are precise," she said, her voice filled with awe. "Look at the telemetry. The tremors are localized. They are using the seismic waves to liquefy the blockage in the outer core. They are timing the detonations to the millisecond to cancel out the destructive harmonics. It isn't brute force, Thraxis. It is surgery. It is surgery performed with a sledgehammer, but surgery nonetheless." Down on the surface, the humans were everywhere. They deployed mobile atmospheric scrubbers, ugly loud machines that sucked in the air and belched out clean clouds of vapor. They set up medical camps. The Voltari citizens, terrified at first, began to emerge. They saw the humans walking without suits, their skin sweating in the heat, their muscles straining as they hauled equipment that would require a gravity lift for a Voltari. There were incidents, of course, misunderstandings. A Voltari child wandered too close to a drilling rig. A human roughneck, moving with reflex speed impossible for a Voltari, snatched the child away from a collapsing vent. The child's mother screamed, thinking the human was attacking. The human just set the child down, patted its head with a hand that could crush stone, and went back to work. Malachar began to understand the designation Deathworlder. It wasn't just about strength. It was about resilience. These creatures accepted noise, dirt, pain, and exhaustion as natural states of existence. They did not despair when the machine broke. They swore, hit it, and fixed it. They did not weep when the storm came. They built a roof. They possessed a stubborn refusal to die that was almost spiritual in its intensity. On the 14th day, the Hephaestus fired. It was not a weapon discharge. It was a beam of concentrated muon particles and thermal energy directed straight down the polar borehole. The sky turned a blinding white. The planet screamed. Every Voltari on the surface fell to the ground, shielding their sensory nodes. In the council chamber, the lights failed. Emergency power kicked in. The floor pitched 40 degrees. Malachar was thrown from his dais, sliding across the obsidian floor. He scrambled for purchase, his mind screaming that this was the end, that the humans had cracked the world in half. And then silence. Real silence. Not the heavy, stagnant silence of the tomb, but the expectant silence of a paused breath. "Reading," Willow's voice was shaky. She was pulling herself up to the console. "Reading magnetic field fluctuations, core rotation, increasing 3%, 5% by the light. The dynamo is restarting." A cheer erupted from the human comms channel, a raucous, chaotic sound of shouting, clapping, and barking laughter. "Solid lock on the core restart," Admiral Thorne's voice cut through, sounding exhausted but triumphant. "Planetary shield grid is coming online in T-10 minutes. You might want to look outside, Archon. We're about to clee." "Are the airs?" Malachar dragged himself to the viewing balcony. The heavy blast shields retracted. Above the massive atmospheric processors, the humans had seeded into the clouds, engaged in unison. They were waiting for the magnetic field to stabilize. Now, with the magnetosphere pushing back the solar radiation, they fired. Beams of ionization arced across the sky, breaking apart the heavy smog, precipitating the toxins out as harmless rain. The black clouds swirled, boiled, and then, like a curtain being pulled back, they broke. For the first time in 300 years, a shaft of pure, golden sunlight pierced the gloom and struck the spire of the High Synod. It wasn't the dim, filtered light they had grown used to. It was bright. It was warm. It hit Malachar's face, and he flinched, then wept. The Deathworlders hadn't just fixed the machine. They had brought back the dawn. The departure of the human fleet was as organized as their arrival, but far less tense. The atmosphere was still healing, the tectonic plates were settling, but the world was alive. The Voltari people looked up not with fear, but with a reverence usually reserved for the divines. Admiral Thorne stood once more in the grand chamber. He had removed his bulky suit, wearing a dress uniform of dark blue with gold piping. He looked cleaner but no less dangerous. The weariness was still there, hidden behind the eyes. Malachar descended from his dais, a breach of protocol that made the other counselors gasp. He walked until he stood before the human. He had to crane his neck to look up at Thorne, despite the human being shorter. The presence of the man was simply that large. "You have saved us," Malachar said, his voice echoing in the vast hall. "There is no debt calculus that can balance this. We have analyzed your work. You used resources that exceed the GDP of entire systems. You risked your ships, you risked your lives, and you ask for nothing." Thorne smiled, a smaller, sadder smile this time. "We don't want payment, Archon, we want allies." "Allies?" Malachar spread his hands. "Look at us, Admiral. We are frail. We are artists and philosophers. We cannot fight your wars. We cannot survive on your worlds. What use are we to the United Terran Coalition?" Thorne's expression hardened. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The savior was gone, the soldier was back. "I told you before," Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave. "Your world wasn't dying naturally, it was murdered. We found the emitter that was damping your sun. We found the tectonic destabilizers. They were old, Archon, ancient, and they were distinctive." Thorne tapped a device on his wrist, and a holographic projection materialized between them. It showed a shape, a jagged, impossible geometric structure, blacker than the void of space. It looked like a shard of hate carved from the fabric of the universe. Malachar felt a primal chill seize his hearts. He did not know what it was, but his genetic memory screamed in terror. "We call them the Silenced," Thorne said. "We don't know where they come from, dark space, another dimension. It doesn't matter. They don't invade, they don't conquer, they just turn out the lights. They find civilizations that are bright, loud, and beautiful, and they quietly snuff them out. They tried to do it to us a long time ago. We survived. You almost didn't." Thorne stepped closer, his voice intense. "We aren't building an empire, Archon. We're building a fortress. We need you. Not to hold a rifle, not to pilot a fighter. We have plenty of Deathworlders for that. We have the Krogan, the Haxeler, the humans. We have the muscle." "Then what?" Malachar whispered. "We need the light," Thorne said. "The Silence target civilizations that create, that dream, that bring order to chaos. You are the oldest dreamers left. We need your archivists to decode their signals. We need your philosophers to understand their logic so we can break it. We need your art to remind us what we're fighting for when the blood gets up to our knees." Thorne held out a hand, a human gesture, open, palm up. "The galaxy is getting darker," the human said. "A great night is coming. We intend to set it on fire so that nothing can hide in the shadows. But we need someone to hold the torch while we swing the sword. Will you stand with us?" Malachar looked at the hand. It was scarred, calloused, a tool of war and labor. It was a hand that had pulled a child from a vent and cracked a planet's crust to save it. It was the hand of a monster that had chosen to be a guardian. The High Archon of the Voltari, ruler of the Crystal Spires, reached out his slender, translucent hand and placed it into the heavy, warm grip of the human. "The Voltari stand with Terra," Malachar vowed, and he felt the strength of the human's grip anchor him against the coming storm. "We will not go quietly into the night." "Good," Thorne said, and the grin that split his face was terrifying and beautiful, because we just woke up the neighborhood. The implications of the alliance rippled through the Voltari society faster than the seismic waves of the Hephaestus. The revelation that their near extinction was an assassination attempt rather than a natural tragedy shattered their pacifist dogma. They did not become warriors. Their biology did not permit it. But they became something perhaps more dangerous. They became the intelligence behind the brute. In the months that followed, human engineering core remained on Voltar. They didn't just repair, they upgraded. Planetary shields were reinforced with Terran kinetic barriers. The orbital shipyards, dormant for centuries, began to hum with activity, but they were not building the fragile solar yachts of the past. They were refitting the massive, scarred hulls of Terran cruisers with Voltari sensor suites, crystalline cogitators, and faster-than-light drive algorithms that the humans, with their linear thinking, could never have derived. It was a synthesis of the hammer and the scalpel, Archivist Villo found herself at the center of this new age. She worked alongside Dr. Aris Thorne, the Admiral's brother and lead xenologist. They spent cycles in the deep archives beneath the capital, sifting through data the Voltari had considered noise for millennia. Here, Villo pointed to a spectral analysis on the holodable. They were in the deep vault, a room of whispering crystals. This anomaly appeared 4,000 years ago, just before the great dimming of the sector. Aris leaned in. He was less imposing than his brother, softer, but he possessed that same human intensity, a relentless drive to know. It matches the signature we found on the dead worlds in the Perseus arm, phase-shifted neutrinos. It's a tracking signal. Villo shuddered. They mark us like cattle. Like weeds, Aris corrected grimly. They mark the garden. When it gets too vibrant, they spray the poison. He looked at Villo. Your people have records going back 50,000 years. You might have the only complete map of the silenced network in existence. You just didn't know how to read it. And if we find them? Villo asked. What then? The Admiral speaks of war, but these entities, they manipulate stars, they dampen physics. How do you fight gods? Aris laughed, a dry, sharp sound. We killed our own gods a long time ago, Villo. Then we took their fire. The silenced rely on entropy. They rely on despair. They rely on civilizations giving up. They've never met a species that views the laws of physics as a suggestion. He pulled up a schematic of a new ship class being laid down in the orbital docks above Earth, Mars, and now Volta. It was massive. It was a dreadnought, but its core was Voltari crystal tech amplified by Terran fusion reactors. We're building a lantern, Aris said. A ship capable of projecting a reality anchor. It reverses the damping fields. It forces the laws of physics to normalize in a localized area. If the silence try to turn off the sun, this ship turns it back on and locks the switch. Villo stared at the schematic. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was the perfect marriage of her people's grace and the human's insanity. You really believe we can win? She said softly. I don't believe in winning, Aris replied, looking up at the ceiling towards the stars. I believe in surviving, and right now, survival means making sure the other guy doesn't. The test came sooner than anyone expected. 3 years after the saving of Volta, the deep space listening posts, now manned by mixed crews of Voltari sensory monks and Terran radar techs, picked up a scream. It wasn't a radio signal. It was a gravitational scream. A system in the adjacent sector, the home of the Haxiller, a reptilian species of proud warriors who had recently joined the coalition, was being strangled. Their star was fluctuating, the same pattern. The silenced had returned to finish the weeding. In the high synod chamber, the mood was different this time. There was no fear. There was cold, hard calculation. Malachar stood before the display. Admiral Thorne was there, via holographic link from the bridge of the UNSC Dauntless. They are hitting the Haxiller, Thorne reported. Standard pattern, gravitational dampening, tectonic destabilization. The Haxiller fleet is engaging, but they're shooting at shadows. The enemy ships are phase-shifted. They can't hit them. They are not in real space, Villo said, her fingers flying across her console. They are sitting in the fold between dimensions, projecting the weapon, but we can see them, the upgrades to the sensor grid. I have a lock, 3 targets, massive tonnage. Malachar looked at the display. The red dots of the enemy, the blue dots of the dying Haxiller, and the white dots of the Terran coalition fleet mustering at the jump point. Admiral, Malachar said, his voice steady. The Light of Othries is... 80. The Light of Othries was the first of the hybrid ships, a Voltari dreadnought. Deploy it, Thorne commanded. Link your targeting data to our kinetic batteries. You light 'em up, Archon, we'll knock 'em down. The battle was not fought in the atmosphere of a planet, but in the void between stars. The coalition fleet jumped in. To the Haxiller, who were watching their sun turn purple and die, it must have looked like a miracle. Hundreds of human ships, blocky and brutal, exited slipspace in a wall of steel. But the centerpiece was the Othries. It was a spire of crystal and chrome, glowing with an internal light that outshone the distant stars. Activating reality anchor, the Voltari captain of the Othries broadcasted. A pulse of pure, white energy exploded from the ship. It washed over the system. It didn't destroy matter, it stabilized it. It enforced the laws of physics with a cosmic shout. The phase cloaks of the silenced failed. Suddenly, 3 massive, jagged shadows were ripped from the dark dimension and forced into real space. They were monstrous, shifting geometries that hurt the eyes to look at. They looked like glitches in the universe. "Targets revealed," Thorne yelled over the comms. "All batteries fire for effect. Show them what Deathworlders do to pests." The human fleet unleashed hell. Railguns, nuclear missiles, plasma lances. The combined fury of a species that had spent 5,000 years perfecting the art of killing was directed at the three anomalies. The silenced ships, accustomed to helpless prey that withered and died, had no shields against kinetic impacts of this magnitude. They shattered. They didn't explode. They unraveled, dissolving into clouds of exotic particles as their containment fields failed under the barrage. The Haxeler sun flared back to life, its color returning to a healthy yellow-orange. On the bridge of the Dauntless, Thorne watched the debris field expand. There were no cheers this time, just a grim satisfaction. "Target destroyed," the tactical officer reported. "Scanning for more, negative, sector is clear." Thorne opened a channel to the light of Othries. "Good shooting, Othries," that was illuminating. Malacher, watching from the Synod, felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was pride. Not the pride of an artist who has painted a masterpiece, but the pride of a guardian who has protected the weak. "We are learning, Admiral," Malacher replied. "The darkness is vast, but it is not invincible." The victory at the Haxeler system changed the galaxy. The signal went out. It wasn't a distress call anymore. It was a rallying cry. A dying world reached out, the history books would later say, but the text would continue. It would tell of how the Deathworlders, the humans, the survivors, the mad engineers of Earth reached back. And in that grasp, a new order was forged. The coalition grew. The Galactic Council, once a place of bickering and stagnation, was dissolved. In its place rose the alliance of Saul and Othries. But the story did not end with a battle. It ended with a realization. 10 years after the alliance, Villo and Aris stood on the surface of a new world. It was a barren rock on the edge of the galactic rim. The humans were terraforming it, of course. Massive engines were churning the sky. "We found the source," Villo said quietly. She was holding a data pad, looking at the stars. "The silenced, we tracked the trajectory of the ships we destroyed. We know where they came from." "And?" Aris asked. "They aren't invaders, Aris," Villo said, her voice trembling with the magnitude of the discovery. "They are automated systems. We found the signal headers. They are mining drones." Aris froze. "Mining drones, they destroy stars." "To harvest the dark matter released by the collapse," Villo explained. "To them, a civilization is just moss growing on the rock they want to mine. They don't hate us. They don't even know we're here. We are an infestation on their ore." The implication hung between them, heavier than gravity. The enemy wasn't an ancient evil. It was an indifferent industry operating on a scale so vast that biological life was a rounding error. "So," Aris said, staring out at the dark rim of the galaxy, "there's someone out there who built them, someone who needs that much power." "Yes," Villo said, "and eventually the miners will report that the moss has started shooting back." Aris smiled. It was the same smile his brother had worn on the day they saved Volter. It was the smile of a human staring at a hurricane. "Good," Aris said. "Let them come, let the builders come, we'll be waiting." He looked at the Voltari woman, then at the human ships filling the sky, and finally at the green shoot of a plant pushing its way through the terraformed soil at his feet. "We are the Deathworlders," Aris said, echoing the words that had started it all. "And we don't just survive the storm, we become it." Villo looked at the plant. It was a Terran oak, genetically modified to grow in silica sand. It was stubborn, hard, and slow, but it would grow, it would crack the rock, it would reach for the sun. "We reached out," she whispered to the wind, "and you reached back, and now the universe will tremble." The camera pulled back, rising above the two figures, above the terraforming engines, above the atmosphere of the new world. It rose past the fleet of silver, crystal, and gray iron, past the reborn sons of the Alliance, and drifted into the deep, endless dark. There in the void, a new signal began to pulse. It was not a cry for help, it was a warning. "Here we stand. We are the light that burns. We are the shield that holds. Humanity has arrived, and we brought friends." The stars seemed to burn a little brighter, pushing back the dark, as the galaxy spun on, no longer silent, no longer afraid.